Okay, so let's continue where we left off last time. So just a quick recap, we were talking about threads, uniprocessor scheduling really, and then threads. We talked about various scheduling policies in the uniprocessor operating systems world. Today we will see how that generalizes to multiprocessors, distributed scheduling, and so on. Okay? The other thing that we talked about last time was threading. So we talked about what are threads, how do they work. We also looked at two examples of how threads are used in a client setting, namely a browser, and also in a server setting, namely a web server. Right? So I'm going to finish a few slides that were not covered last time, and then we will talk about, today we'll talk about multiprocessor and distributed scheduling. Before I continue, if there are any questions, you should always ask during the class. Let me again mention that I said that in the very first lecture. Okay, that way it's more interactive. People get the benefit of if some material is not clear, you can ask a question. It clarifies it for everybody. Okay, so let me continue the discussion on threads. So basically, there are two types of threading packages that you can get. One is referred to as user level threads. The other one is kernel level. Again, this is somewhat of a recap. From if you have done threading in undergrad classes, you probably know this already. Okay, so this picture shows a figure that shows how user level threads work. Okay, what is a user level thread? So let's define that term first. So user level thread packages are ones that implement the entire threading functionality in user space. Okay? The kernel is not aware of the presence of threads at all. Neither does the operating system kernel explicitly support threads. The entire abstraction is implemented as a library in user space, and applications link to that library and make use of thread management. So here is a figure that shows, I guess this box is not completely visible, but these boxes here to the left are processes. This is how this process is visible to the operating system, and this is basically how they are mapped to cores or processors on the hardware. Okay? As you can see, these sort of circular arrows indicate threads. Okay? So this is a process with 2 threads, this is a process with 3 threads, that's a process with 3 threads. Okay? As far as the OS is concerned, since it does not support threads, and it doesn't actually the threads are not even visible to them. To the OS, this just looks like a traditional single-threaded process. That's right, because it doesn't know that there are threads inside that process. So you will see, as far as the OS is concerned, it basically assumes of things that this is a traditional single-threaded process, which is why you only see one thread at the OS level. So how do threads work here? So what the OS scheduler does is it first picks a process for execution. Okay? So it is going to say that this process gets to run. Okay? Then what happens is once the process gets to run, the threads library has its own scheduler. Okay? So that's what is referred to as a library scheduler. So once the process gets to run, the library scheduler decides which of the threads should actually run on the CPU. Okay? So it's a 2-level scheduling decision where the OS first picks a process to run, and the thread scheduler in the user library then decides which of the threads inside that process will actually run. Okay, so scheduling of threads inside the process is actually done by a library in user space. Scheduling of processes is done by the kernel in kernel space. Okay, so that's what a user level thread is. Now there are advantages and disadvantages of using user level thread packages. Okay, the first advantage is that you don't depend on the OS to implement threading functionality. There may be many implementations of thread packages. You can pick whichever one is best suited for your application as an application designer. Okay? And there may be multiple different threading packages that are all coexisting in the system used by different processes. Okay? So more flexibility for the application designer. Okay? That's a key advantage. You are not restricted by the CPU scheduler in the kernel. If your application needs a different kind of scheduler for its threads, you can pick a threading package that provides that kind of scheduling support for you. Okay? Typically, you cannot change the kernel scheduler, so you're stuck with it. But if your thread in your application need a different kind of scheduling for whatever reason, then you are not restricted because you can pick a library scheduler and a thread package that provides that function for you, or you could even write your own. Yeah? That's the second advantage. Third advantage is very lightweight and efficient because all thread management is done in user space. Creating threads, deleting threads, managing or synchronizing threads are all library calls. Okay? They do not involve system calls, which are more heavyweight. Okay, neither do they require kernel intervention in the form of interrupts or CPU scheduling. Okay, so scheduling, switching between threads within a process is extremely lightweight. Creating a thread is very lightweight. It's just a simple function called library rather than a system call. Okay? Those are all advantages. Okay? If you can think of any disadvantage, if you can think of a disadvantage of user level threads, let me know what you think they are.
Does it get smaller CPU share in comparison to others that use kernel level threads?
Okay. So first point that is being made is maybe you get smaller CPU share as compared to other kernel level. Okay, clearly that's true because the kernel scheduler is not aware of the presence of threads. There may be one application here with 2 threads, another application here with 100 threads. Okay? As far as the kernel is concerned, it just sees a single threaded process. So it's going to treat them the same way. It's going to give them identical CPU shares. Okay, whereas if you wanted to be more fair, you would give more CPU time to the process with 100 threads because it has more threads to run. The kernel doesn't know. Okay, this is all transparent to the kernel. So it is not able to, okay, the advantage of having your own scheduler and doing your own scheduling in user space becomes a disadvantage as far as the kernel scheduler is concerned because it basically is not able to differentiate between specific thread level needs of processes. Okay. That's indeed a disadvantage. Anything else?
You are limited by the number of threads in the kernel space.
You are limited by the number of threads in kernel space. If you are in user level threads package, you should be only limited by whatever the threads library would do for you, not necessarily what the kernel would. What you say is true when you come to kernel level. So that's coming next. Anything else that you can think of?
When the thread blocks, then the entire process blocks.
Okay. So the other disadvantage here is if your user level threads and one thread does I/O. If you remember last time I said if a process starts doing I/O, is taken away, taken out of the ready queue and put into a wait queue, waiting for the I/O to finish. Okay. So if this thread here, or let's say this one is the one running, if one thread here starts doing I/O, the entire process will block, even though there may be other threads that are ready to run. Right? The reason again is that kernel doesn't know that there are threads in that process. If the process does I/O, it assumes that the process as a whole is doing I/O. It cannot distinguish that only one thread in that process is doing I/O and others are ready to run. Yeah, so the entire process will block. So those are some disadvantages of user level threads. Yeah, so we talked about advantages, disadvantages. Yes, there's a question.
Would library scheduler deal with that in an appropriate way if one thread is blocking? The same way the operating system scheduler does.
Okay. Question is, can't the library scheduler deal with this? If one thread blocked, why is the process blocking? Okay. So if you look at it from the kernel standpoint, if there was a way for the library scheduler to deal with it, it should have done that. Right? But when you see it from the kernel's perspective, here's a process that has just done an I/O, or it's basically making a blocking call. Okay? So it is going to take that entire process and say that the process is blocked because it cannot figure out that there is a thread in there. Okay? There's no way for the library scheduler to make an I/O request to the kernel, but say don't block me as a process because the kernel is going to treat that entire thing as a process and just block the whole process. Okay, next up to kernel level threads. Okay, so this is basically the entire opposite of whatever we said in user level threads. So in particular, the kernel is the one that is supporting functionality, the thread functionality. It implements threading support for applications. It is aware of threads inside a process. Okay, it's basically, it deals with the management of threads, creating threads, deleting threads are all managed by the operating system kernel. So whenever any process here wants to do something with threads, it has to make system calls to the kernel to say either create a thread, delete a thread, block on this lock or semaphore or whatever else you may be doing, okay, or do IO. So here, as you can see now, for every thread in user space, there is a corresponding entity that's visible to the kernel. Okay, because these threads are directly visible at the kernel level. So the kernel scheduler is now not scheduling a process, it is scheduling or choosing a thread within a process to run on the CPU. Okay, so it can say run this thread, not the entire process, and let the library scheduler deal with which thread. That was in the user level. So you can explicitly pick which thread gets to run next. These are cores. So here you can see that this thread here is saying running, so that's the one that's run. Because the kernel decides which thread from which process is going to be scheduled next on the CPU. Okay. So that's kernel level thread. So basically, threading support is implemented at kernel level. As a result, applications can directly make use of it. You don't have to go fetch a library to deal with it. Okay, so now, again, very quickly, we'll talk about advantages and disadvantages here. So basically, you have to realize that all the advantages of user level threads become disadvantages here and vice versa. Okay. So the first thing we said is it's very efficient to do thread management in user level threads. So clearly now, all thread management is done by the kernel. It requires system calls. In the user level threads case, it was all library function calls. Okay, so more expensive in kernel level threads. Here to do all of this. Scheduling, here you are restricted or by whatever the kernel CPU scheduler is doing. You can't pick your own scheduling algorithm. Yeah, that's another disadvantage. But the flip side is now that the kernel is aware of the presence of threads, it can give more CPU time to processes that are more threads than others, which you could not have done in user level threads. Okay, so everything is getting flipped. As you can see, all the disadvantages here are becoming advantages. The other thing we said in user level threads is if a thread blocks, the entire process blocks. Here, if a thread blocks, okay, this is a thread that's actually running. As you can see, if this thread blocks, only that thread is going to block. Okay? These other two threads may be runnable. They still stay in the runnable state and they can be chosen for execution. So the process as a whole can continue to make progress even if some subset of its threads are blocked. Okay? So these are some things to keep in mind. There's one more thing that we should keep in mind which I did not mention is user level threads cannot directly make user level thread packages cannot directly make use of the presence of multiple cores for a single process. Okay. But kernel level threads can actually exploit the presence of multiple processors or multiple cores and provide thread level parallelism. Okay. The reason for this is, as you can imagine, here if there may be 3 threads, okay, you are only scheduling that process on one core because you don't know the presence of multiple threads. Okay. So you can only schedule each process on a core. Okay, and as a result, a thread within that process can only be running on one core at a time. In this case, it is possible for the CPU scheduler to pick multiple threads from a process and map them to multiple cores. So you will actually get thread level parallelism, which you could not have gotten in the case of user level threads package. Okay, so if you the short thing to keep in mind is if your user level threads adding cores to your machine does not speed up a single process. Okay? Multiple independent processes can run on different cores, but threads from the same process cannot run on multiple cores at the same time. That is possible in kernel level threads. Okay? Very quickly, I'll mention this notion of a lightweight process. So one thing, if you sort of look at the 2 pictures I just showed, I'm going to go back. If you look at how user level threads are mapped into entities that are known to the kernel, you can see that user level thread packages do many to one mapping. Many threads in user space are mapped to one kernel schedulable entity in kernel space. That's the address space. Okay. Kernel level threads have a one-to-one mapping. Every user level thread has a kernel schedulable entity. that the kernel can choose for execution, in which case that user level thread also starts executing. By user level thread, I mean a thread in user space or in an address space. Okay. So in one case we have a many-to-one mapping. In another case we have one-to-one mapping. Okay. Now if you generalize this notion and you let the application designer pick the right type of mapping of threads in a process to entities in a kernel space, okay, then you get this notion of a lightweight process. Okay. What this notion is of a lightweight process does is it allows flexibility in how threads within your process get mapped into whatever the kernel is going to do in terms of scheduling. You can use a many-to-one mapping, you can use a one-to-one mapping, or you can use a many-to-many mapping. Okay. This allows you the entire range. If you use a lightweight process, you can say, I have many threads, let the kernel have one lightweight process and let all the threads be mapped onto that lightweight process. So here's a figure here. Okay. So these are again your user processes. These are kernel schedulable entities which we will call lightweight processes. Okay. If there's one lightweight process for every thread in a user space, you have a one-to-one mapping. That's exactly what kernel level threads gave you by default. If you have one lightweight process for all the threads in your user space, then you have a many-to-one mapping. That's what user level threads did for you. But you can decide when you start up the process saying I have n threads and I want k lightweight processes where k could be different. Okay. And you can say these 3 threads get mapped onto this lightweight process, but this thread I need a one-to-one mapping, and then these 5 threads go and map onto a lightweight process. So you can decide how to bind threads within your process to a lightweight process in kernel space. Okay. This mapping can be done by application designers when you design your threading process. And you can decide, saying, this thread is doing more important tasks in my process, so it needs a lightweight process of its own. These 3 threads are doing less important tasks, so I'm going to bind them all to the same lightweight process and let them share the resources of that lightweight process, and so on. Okay. So this is a more advanced threading package where you can decide, in addition to doing whatever you could do in kernel level threads, you can also decide how threads get mapped to lightweight processes in the kernel space. Right? What the OS is going to do again is a 2-level scheduling decision. It will always schedule lightweight processes for execution. Right? And depending on how many threads are mapped onto that lightweight process, there has to be an additional scheduling decision that's done at user space. If multiple of those threads are mapped, then the user level threads library that would have to decide which of the threads that are mapped onto that LWP gets to run next. Okay? Again, so you have to do a 2-level scheduling in this case. Okay. So the notion of lightweight processes was first implemented in Solaris, which is an operating system that was designed by Sun Microsystem, now Oracle. It's still there in Solaris. Okay. It's a very flexible design. It allowed you to figure out what kinds of mappings are best, how do you decide all this mapping. And if you did not want to deal with it, you did not have to. Okay. There were always default policies. Like you can decide, let the kernel decide how many lightweight processes to create. The kernel could dynamically figure that out and dynamically map based on observations of how threads are actually executed. If it's a CPU bound thread or an IO bound thread, you could get different mappings, for instance. Okay, so there are many things that the kernel would do for you, which I'm going to basically skip the details here. I just want to mention 2 threading packages and then we'll move on. Okay, so the 2 that probably you encounter the most are POSIX threads, or what are called P threads. Okay, these are threads that are used either in C or C++. Okay. Threading support is not built in either the C or C++ languages. You have to use a threads library. Okay. P threads is basically, which stands for POSIX threads, is a standard that is widely used. Okay. It's used in, so if you typically write a threading application in C or C++, you end up using P threads. Okay. Now keep in mind that P thread just defines the interface. It defines what functions are used to create threads, delete threads, to do synchronization. So you may have calls like pthread create. Okay, this is used to create a thread. You can have pthread delete and so on and so forth. Okay. Any one who implements a package that exposes that interface is compliant with pthread. That's a pthreads library. What pthreads doesn't say is whether you need to implement it at user level or kernel level. That is left to the designer of the kernel or designer of the package. Okay, so you can get pthread library that are entirely user space libraries. You can also have pthreads being implemented as part of kernel support. Okay, so there are kernel level threads libraries as well. Okay, so, or you can use LWPs. That's what Solaris does because it already supports lightweight processes. Pthreads is implemented on top of their lightweight process functionality. Okay. The other kinds of threads that you encounter are Java threads. Okay, so Java has threading support built into the language. Okay, this is not a separate library. It has thread support built in, and threads are scheduled by the Java virtual machine in this case. Okay, so it's a two-level scheduling decision. As far as the OS is concerned, it may schedule the JVM, and the JVM might schedule threads. If you implement your threading support in Java as kernel level threads in the JVM, okay, then those threads might be visible all the way to the kernel. So how to implement it is again left to the implementer of that JVM. Okay. So before I actually switch gears, I just want to show you the presence of threads. I'm just going to quickly show you a listing of processes on this machine. Okay, so you will see here, this is just showing you all the processes that are running on this machine. So you see Skype, you see Chrome, you see Safari, Mail. What is shown in this column is the number of threads associated with that process. You see there are some that are as many as 80 threads. Okay, so there's Java running, there's some Java application running, there's 66 threads, there's Skype has 31 threads, not sure what they're all doing. There's Chrome. This is the browser kind of implementation I was showing you. There are 26 threads. Okay, so this is, I mentioned threads that listen for HTML, listen for user clicks, and they make calls to servers. They download content in parallel. So all of that is actually being done by a multi-threaded application. So the other thing to keep in mind is you will see that most of these are actually multi-threaded applications. Okay, typically, when you write complex application, they tend to be multi-threaded. Okay, this is because machines have multiple cores, so you can actually make use of this cores easier to write functions using threads rather than event-based, as we will see. Yes?
These are user level threads or kernel level?
Good question. I should have asked that question myself. Are these user-level threads or kernel-level threads?
Kernel level threads.
Okay, so this is actually, so keep in mind that this information is coming from the kernel space, right? So you see process IDs and process names, you see how much memory has been allocated to each process, all of this is coming from kernel. If the kernel can tell you that there are these many threads, yeah, you should infer that that means threading support is built into the kernel. Okay, so these threads that you see visible are kernel level threads. Okay, there may be processes here which may show up as one thread as far as the kernel is concerned, but they may have implemented a user level threads package, but we can't see that here. Okay. Okay. So let us move on. So we'll just keep going. So we have finished uniprocessor scheduling. I talked about scheduling of threads. Now we'll talk about multiprocessor scheduling, and then we'll do distributed scheduling. So we are just going through the entire spectrum. Okay. So here's a picture that shows you sort of a very simple hardware schematic of what a multiprocessor system looks like. Okay, so and this is the same if you are regardless of whether a multi-core or a multiprocessor system. Okay. So these circles here represent CPUs or cores. Okay, cores in your system. The boxes, the yellow boxes at the top above the blue line represent caches, hardware level caches. Okay, so if you have taken a course in architecture, you probably know that associated with every processor, you may have a L1 cache and an L2 cache and an L3 cache, which are level 1, level 2, level 3 caches. Okay? These hardware level caches store instructions and or data that are fetched from memory. Okay, and then the caches are used to speed up execution of your program or your process. Okay? So what we are going to assume is that basically the L1 and L2 caches are specific to processors, L3 caches may be shared. Okay, typically in a multi-core or a multi-processor system, so some of the caches are shared, but some of them are not shared. They're specific to core. So in this case, you see this cache is actually tied to that core. It's not visible to the other cores in the system. Okay. Why I am sort of describing whether caches are shared or not will become clear in just a minute. Okay. So let's first look at in the abstract two different ways of implementing a multiprocessor scheduler. Okay, so here is how scheduling is going to work when you go from uniprocessor world to a multiprocessor world. Okay? So or multi-core world. So these are processes or cores. I'm going to use the term interchangeably. Okay, what is going to happen is each core is going to make independent scheduling decision. Okay? The kernel is going to run on that processor. Okay? It's going to pick a process for execution. Process is going to run for a time slice. Okay, maybe it uses its time slice, maybe it does I/O and gives up its time slice. Okay, either of those two things can happen. And whenever either the time slice is done or the process has given up its the CPU, the kernel will run again on that core and it will pick the next process for execution and so on. Okay. And each of this will happen in parallel on many processors or all the processors in your system. So each processor is going to run the kernel scheduler and the scheduler will decide what gets to run on that processor next. Okay, that's the same thing that was happening in the uniprocessor world. Whenever the time slice expires, scheduler code runs. Scheduler decides which, or it looks at the ready queue and picks the next one, depending on whether it's a round robin or whatever policy you're getting. Okay, is that clear so far? Okay, so now what is being shown here is a particular implementation of your CPU scheduler where there is a single ready queue. Okay, also referred to as the run queue. The single queue of all the processes or threads that are waiting for a turn to run on the CPU. Okay, there's one global queue. So whenever the kernel scheduler runs, it's going to look at this queue and pick the next task. Okay, maybe they're queued up in a certain order, you pick the task at the head of the queue and run it next. I'm going to use the term task to refer to either a process or a thread. So task basically means one or the other. So if the tasks are queued up here, whenever this scheduler runs on any of those processors, you look at that queue, pick the next task. Okay, so that's one question.
Are each of these queues K-level priority queues or something?
Okay, so right now I've shown this one queue as an abstract queue. Okay. If this scheduler was a multi-level feedback queue, this would be a set of queues. But what I'm saying, the point I'm making is all these queues are shared by all the processors. There's a single abstract queue. Okay, whether it's a priority queue is represented by multiple independent queues or not, they're all shared. Okay, there's sort of one set of queues that all processors are going to share. Okay. Now, because this is a multi-processor world and these queues are shared, you should immediately realize that that's a shared data structure. Okay. So whenever a scheduler runs here or any of the cores, it has to first do synchronization. It has to first lock the queue. Okay. Because it may be the case that the time slice expires at the same time on multiple CPUs. Okay. The scheduler will run on parallel on each of those processors. They'll both try to grab something from the queue. Okay, and then you may basically end up having inconsistency. So whenever you share data structures, you should use synchronization. This is what I mentioned last time when I introduced threading. Yeah, or if you written threaded code, you know this already. Okay, so shared data structures always involve synchronization. They require locking. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, as the number of cores in the system grows, okay, that queue is going to become a bottleneck. Simply because if you have to grab a lock to grab a task from the queue, okay, any other scheduler that is also running has to wait for the lock. Okay, multiple process CPU schedulers will make a request for the lock. One of them will grab the lock, others will block, okay, and then you are basically going to block. Okay, so hence there's going to be a bottleneck. Yeah, the bottleneck will grow as the number of cores increases, simply because the probability that there are multiple CPU schedulers making lock requests will also start increasing. Okay, so what's a way to deal with this situation? Yeah, the reason bottlenecks are bad is that basically cores are idling. CPU scheduler cannot run. It's waiting for the lock. It cannot grab a task and get it to run. Okay, if cores idle, utilization drops. Okay, so that's not good. So what do we do? How would we deal with this situation?
So if you use multiple queues, then and you assign some of the processors to each queue, then there will be less processors disputing the locks for each queue.
Right.
And you solve the bottleneck.
Okay. So only one principle in this entire course. If there's a centralized bottleneck, make it distributed. Yeah, there is no other answer. So that's exactly what is being shown here. Saying if you don't like one queue for the entire system, make one queue for each core. Yeah, so now this is actually showing you a queue that's shared by two cores. So, but I mean, the essential point is go from one queues to many queues. Right? So in the degenerate case, there is one ready queue for every core or every processor. Okay? If you have this, then you basically get rid of this bottleneck, because if that core becomes idle, it only has to look at its own queue. Okay? Queues in this case are not directly shared. Yeah, so then the locking bottleneck goes away. Okay? So you make the queues distributed. So now there is less contention. Okay? As there is less contention, then there is less idling of CPU whenever the scheduler runs, because you will not have to block with a lock. Okay, now, so that has sort of taken this bottleneck problem away, but now you have another set of problems. Right? You have to decide how to assign tasks to these queues. Okay, in this case, there was only one queue, so you basically join that queue. Okay? Now you have n queues. So you have to decide how tasks join, and here's the problem. So if you randomly assign tasks, it may be that some tasks here basically start blocking, start doing I/O. So the number of tasks here will shrink. Okay? Maybe there are more CPU bound tasks in this queue, so the number of tasks in this queue is not going to shrink. So there may be 10 CPU bound tasks here and only 3 here, because the other 7 that you had assigned have gone off to do I/O. Okay? Now you have an imbalance. Okay? This core is more heavily utilized than that. Okay? Tasks in this you are getting less CPU time than tasks in that. Okay? So you basically have a load balancing problem. Okay? You may have queues that are out of balance. There are some queues that have more tasks, other queues have less tasks, and processes or threads that were lucky enough to join a shorter queue start getting a more share of the CPU than others. Okay? So periodically then you have to go and rebalance this queue. You have to say this queue this queue has more tasks, so I'm going to move some tasks from here to here. Okay? So you are basically reduce the bottleneck or contention problem, but then you sort of introduce a new problem, which is trying to load balance these queues. Okay. So basically those are the advantages and disadvantages. So you can use centralized queue, you can use distributed queues. Okay. If you use distributed queues, you have to rebalance every once in a while. Okay. Yes.
Usually there is no restriction on what process can run what queue.
Initially, there's no restriction. Whenever a process comes in, there has to be a scheduler has to decide which queue it joins. Maybe you say, I always pick the least loaded queue, the shortest queue for this process to join. Greedy approach. So you say what is the number of tasks in each queue, pick the shortest one, make it join. Okay, but over a period of time, as queues become go out of balance, you have to rebalance. Okay? Now all that sounds good, so you run this rebalancing thing every once in a while, and all looks good. But it is not. Okay? This is where all this caching thing comes in. Okay? Now, the reason I mentioned the caches is that in the multiprocessor world, the caching actually has a big impact on performance. So the caches are put on processors so that you can speed up the execution of that task on that CPU. So now let's take the scenario where a task has already run on core 1. Okay? If it has run on core 1, some of its data and or instructions are already cached in either the L1 or L2 cache for core 1. Okay? Now if you randomly reassign this task to a queue that belongs to core 2, when it runs next, all the caches on core 2 are cold. There are no data or instructions that are now present in the L1 and L2 caches for core 2 because it had previously run on core 1. So when it executes next, it will see a lot of cache misses. Okay? If it sees a lot of cache misses, performance is actually going to go down quite a bit. The reason the caches are there is they give a very big speed up by getting, not having to go to memory to fetch your instructions or data, you are just fetching them from very fast cache. You start with a cold cache, which means that nothing, no instruction or data is actually cached, you will see a performance hit. Okay. So randomly reassigning a task to a different core from where it ran previously actually causes that task to take a performance hit. Okay. So what that also says is tasks have what are called cache affinity. Okay. Cache affinity says that if you run on a particular core, you have an affinity to that core. Some of your data and or instructions are actually already cached in those L1 and L2 caches. So you would like to rerun that task on that core again. So when you rerun, you already start with a warm cache, not a cold cache. Okay. This optimization allows you to continue to get performance benefits of those presence of cache. Okay. So multiprocessor schedulers also try very hard to rerun once you assign a task to a core, you try as much as possible to rerun that task on that core, okay, to take advantage of cache affinity. Okay. So now go back to these two approaches and you can ask which of these two can deal with cache affinity in a better way. There are only two choices. But then you want to also say why. Okay. So they look at this centralized approach. The centralized approach, whenever a core gets ready to run, it simply takes the job at the beginning of the queue and runs it. Okay. It doesn't look at where that process ran last time it ran. Okay, tasks are queued up. Core becomes idle, you pick a task and you run it. Okay. So there is no control over which task you are picking in this case. Simply you just pick the task at the head. Previously the task may have run somewhere else. So there is very likely that you will pick a task that did not run previously on this core and hence start with a cold cache and cause a tremendous performance drain. Okay. So in this case you are basically going to have problems dealing with cache affinity or respecting the cache affinity of a task. Okay. That is not the case if you have a single queue per core. If you have a single queue per core, you basically run the task and it goes back to the end of that queue. So it's going to run again on that same core. So cache affinity is respected when you distribute it, except for the case when you're doing load balancing. If you're doing load balancing and you reassign a task, then it is going to start with a cold cache. Okay. So you don't want to load balance often. Okay. But if you don't load balance often, you're going to get imbalances, which is also unfair. So you have to make a trade-off. Are you better off load balancing more frequently and causing performance hits? Or are you better off letting some unfairness creep into your system and some tasks are getting more CPU time than others? So there's no one answer to this question. Clearly, every operating system makes its own choice. Okay, but most will not pick centralized queue because there you have a problem of cache affinity, which is much worse. Okay. Here there's perfect fairness. There's complete load balancing. So everybody gets an equal task. Not equal, every task gets equal share. Okay, and you can also show from queuing literature that having one queue reduces waiting time than having more than one. If you think of any scenario where there are tellers and that you go to a bank and there are tellers and each teller has their own queue. Sometimes some tellers queues move faster than others and you always seem to join the slowest queue and say I should have joined another queue. Okay. But if you have one queue for all the tellers, it seems more fair. Okay. The fast teller is just servicing more, but the queues moves at a uniform rate. Same problem exists here. Yes, if you have imbalance or some tasks are taking less time, there you get more CPU time for other tasks in shorter queues. Okay. So design decisions are not trivial in the multiprocessor world. You have to deal with all of these issues. And the last thing is the context switch overhead. Typically, because there are issues of cache affinity and sometimes tasks get reassigned and start with cold caches and so on, you try to have time slices that are somewhat longer to allow the caches to warm up and so on and so forth. So in multiprocessor world, the time slices assigned to tasks are a little longer than in the uniprocessor world. because some of these other issues creep up which were not present in uniprocessor scenarios. Okay, that's the last slide on multiprocessor. Before we switch to distributed, we will see if there are any questions here. Yes, no? Oh, good.
Is it an issue when you have a large number of processes in the same queue, in the sense that you cannot exploit this cache affinity because when the process comes into the server processor again, then all the cache was.
Okay, so question is, since the cache is shared, it's a good question. If the cache is shared, even if we have a single queue per core, we have a shared cache and there are lots of tasks in that queue, every task is going to run. Okay, it's going to fetch more data and instructions, and some old data and instructions get ejected from the cache. And presumably they belong to some other task that had previously run. So when you restart this process, you start with a warm cache, but the lot of your previously cached data or instructions have been ejected. Right? So that is indeed the case. As the number of tasks in the system grows, the probability that some of the data you fetched into the cache when you ran previously are now no longer in the cache. And this is primarily the reason you have L1, L2 and L3 caches. That is true even in the uniprocessor world. What you said is no different. Even if you have just one core, that is true. You are sharing that cache. If you have lots and lots of tasks, some other tasks will come and eject your data. So when you run next, you will not have as much data. Okay? But maybe it's gone from the L1 cache, it's still in the L2. L2 and L3 caches are bigger than L1 caches. Okay? So you have multiple levels of caching precisely for that reason. That even if some data has gone from a faster cache is there in a next level slower cache, okay, with higher and higher probability. Yes, or yes, that's true. But you can put bigger caches and somewhat slower at higher levels to partially deal with that problem. Any other questions here? Okay, so last point I wanted to make was this is an application of not an application, use of scheduling to schedule parallel applications. So this is the only slide I have on parallel applications in this topic of scheduling. So parallel applications are the ones that are highly multi-threaded, that are trying to make use of large multiprocessors. So there may be 62-way, 128-way multiprocessors or multi-cores that you get, and you may have applications that are massively threaded, okay, where the threads are actually running in parallel to achieve some task. And when you have the specialized parallel applications, they also have specialized schedulers. Okay. What I showed you was general purpose schedulers that are used in either multi-core or multi-processor environment. They don't pay attention to multiple threads within a process and try to optimize for threads within a process. They are just trying to be fair. So these are n threads and you try to achieve fairness across it. Whether some of those threads belong to one process or another, you don't do anything special. When you have massively parallel application, you have specialized schedulers that try to schedule all the threads from an application on all the cores all at once. Okay? This is referred to as core scheduling or gang scheduling. You take the entire group, let's say there are n cores, and you want to run the next application, you take that application and take its n threads and map them onto n. And they all run. And the reason this is useful is this parallel application also communicate. The threads frequently send messages between one another. Okay. So if thread A sends a message to thread B, if that thread B was not running at the moment, you have to wait until that thread gets scheduled before that message is received and processed. If you schedule them both at once, then you can send a message, that message is received and maybe a response is all sent in the same time slice. Okay. So coordinated, this is coordinated scheduling of threads. So you are paying attention to threads within a process and trying to coordinate how they get mapped onto cores all at once. Okay. Specialized schedulers, not used in the general purpose world, but often used when you have massively parallel applications. Okay. This entire technique that I mentioned is referred to as core scheduling or gang scheduling, as I mentioned. Okay. So you will see the schedulers on special purpose machines where people are trying to execute massively parallel code. And you have to do interesting optimizations if one thread blocks. If there are mapped n threads from an application onto n cores, Let's say one of those threads blocks. What do? You block all the threads because you want to run them all at once or nothing? Do you let one thread go off, but then you no longer coordinate the scheduling? So you have to make these interesting design decisions. What do you do if one thread blocks, but then other threads are still ready? Is it all or nothing? Is it some or all? You have to make these decisions. So, not going to say much more about this. I just wanted to mention that there are these specialized multiprocessor schedulers which we will not actually deal with in this course, but you should be aware of them. Okay. So that's the material on multiprocessor scheduling. Now we will talk about distributed scheduling. Okay, so let me first explain what do we mean by distributed scheduling. So now we have gone from uniprocessors to multiprocessors. Now we are going to go from multiprocessor to a system with more multiple machines. Okay, so we'll assume a scenario where there are n machines in the system. Okay. Jobs come in, jobs or tasks come in, and they are scheduled locally by machine. Each machine has its own queue. The question we are going to ask is, does it ever benefit the system if a job that has come into machine A is actually shipped off and executed actually on machine B? Right? Similar to what we said here, where you could have joined this ready queue, but because you wanted to load balance, you moved some tasks from this queue to another. You basically moved some tasks from one core to another. Does it make sense to do the same thing in the distributed world where you have n machines or n workstations? Is it the case that some machines might be loaded, so you say, I take some of those tasks and move it for less loaded machines? If you have a scheduler that actually has the ability to decide which tasks get to run on which machines in your system of n machines, you have a distributed scheduler. Okay? So now first we'll ask the question, when does it make sense, what does it do, etc. Okay, so there's a figure here, and there is some material here. So this basically, I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but this problem people have dealt with from a modeling perspective, they have dealt with from an algorithmic design perspective. So this is just one slide on the modeling perspective, where we assume that each machine in the system is independent. Tasks can arrive independently at any machine. We have also assumed that it's MM1, but let's not worry about that. So we are going to ask the question, when does it make sense to employ a distributed scheduler at all in the system? Okay? So to answer that question, we will basically ask this other complementary question, which is, what is the probability that there is at least one system idle, that one machine in your pool of n machines is idle, and there is some machine where a job is actually waiting to run next? Okay. And I'll explain this question in just a moment, but what this figure is actually showing is basically the x-axis is the utilization of the system as a whole. It goes from 0% utilized to 100% utilized, so 0 to 1. Okay? And the y-axis is the probability that this question is actually true, or the answer to this question is this. And the probability with which this scenario will actually occur. And you will see that the probability goes up and then tapers off again. Okay? And we have to understand why that is the case. You don't need to understand modeling to do this, we just need to understand from an intuitive perspective. Okay? So let's forget about this model for just a moment. And let's ask the following question. Okay? Let's basically assume that the system as a whole, your entire system as a whole, is lightly loaded. Low utilization in your entire system. Okay. That's a new task. You are the user, you submit a new job or new task to this system. Okay. It picks a random, you basically pick a machine, but let's assume that machine is chosen randomly. It doesn't matter. You pick a machine and you submit that job to that machine. Okay. The question is, what is the probability that you basically have a machine that was idle? There's a question here, let me repeat the scenario. We assume that the system as a whole is lightly loaded. Okay, it doesn't say anything about a particular machine. It's just saying, I take the load on each machine, I average it out, and the load is low. The average load in the system is low. Okay? Now you, a user, basically pick a machine and submit a task, new task to that machine. The question is with what probability have you chosen a machine that's idle? What's the probability that that's an idling machine? Is it high or low? Okay, so it has to be high. If the system as a whole is lightly loaded, there are many machines that might be sitting there idling or doing very little work. So you submit a job to the system, with high probability it is going to go to a machine where there is nothing else happening on that system. Okay. Then if that is the scenario, then basically you have to ask the question, do you need a distributed scheduler in this case at all? You shouldn't, because tasks come in, they come to a system and machine is idle. There's no reason to move it anywhere else. This machine is as good as any other machine. It's a lightly loaded machine. Correct? Now let's take the exact opposite scenario. Let's assume that the average load in the system is very high. Okay, again, it doesn't say anything about individual machine. It just says I took the load on all the machine, I averaged it, average load is high. Again, you submit a job to the system. Okay, job joins machine I. Okay, with what probability is this machine going to be have other jobs executed? That probability high or low? Okay, again, it says the machine, not the machine, system as a whole is heavily loaded, and a new job arises into the system. Then it's very likely that it's joining a system where there are other jobs running as well. Okay. So now you could argue if this machine has other jobs running, maybe I should find a different machine for this job. Okay. I should basically employ a distributed scheduler that is going to send this job elsewhere. Okay. But which machine would you pick if the system as a whole is heavily loaded?
You could check some of the machines and see if some is idle.
You could check some machines and see if there are some idle. But the probability of a machine being idle starts going to zero as the overall load in the system keeps increasing. Okay? So it's very unlikely, although you can look, it's very unlikely you will come up with an answer saying there is an idle machine in the system, because every machine seems to be loaded. Okay? So then would you want to use a distributed scheduler? You can try to send the job somewhere else, but you are unlikely to succeed because there is no machine that is willing to accept your job, because they are all doing work with high probability. Okay? All this is with randomized. You have to always say with high probability. Okay? So it seems like if the system is lightly loaded, there is no point doing distributed scheduling. You just run the job there. You don't need to send it elsewhere. If the system is heavily loaded, also there isn't much use of doing distributed scheduling because there's nowhere else to send the job, so you may as well run it here. All machines are loaded, so the job is anyway going to run slowly overall. Okay. So in either of these two scenarios, you cannot actually get any benefit of using a distributed scheduler. Yes.
But when the system is heavily loaded, don't you get the benefit of load balancing when you check the machines and put the one with the smallest queue?
Yes, you can basically get load balance. So it all assumes that in a randomized world that they are somewhat equally loaded. If there is some skews in load, you can send it. But in any case, if there are other jobs waiting, you have to basically time share. You're not going to get the entire system to yourself and run quickly. You're still going to share it, and you will be slowed down. You get one end of the CPU time if there are n jobs on that system. So that's basically what this question was asking. What is the probability that there is at least one system idle and there is at least one job waiting? And if the system as a whole is heavily loaded, the probability that at least one system is idle is almost 100%. Okay, there are actually many machines that are idle, let alone one, but there is at least one with very high probability. Okay. The probability that there is at least one job waiting is almost zero because most of the machines are idle. So basically, if you take those two probabilities, and this is saying and, the probability that both of those events are true is zero. Okay, so you take one probability of 1 and probability of 0, multiply them, you get 0. Okay. So it's when you're in a lightly loaded world, many machines are idle and no jobs are waiting. And in a heavily loaded world, the probability that at least one system is idle is almost zero, because every system is more or less loaded. The probability that at least one job is waiting is very high, because every machine also seems to have a job waiting. You take the product of those probabilities, again you have probabilities. Okay? So that's basically these two extremes. Okay? And now if you sort of think about this for the next time, you'll see, you'll realize that distributed scheduling is beneficial only in scenarios where there is at least one idle machine and there is at least one job that has just basically joined a machine where there is load, so it can move to an idle machine. So if both of those things are true, then you get the most benefit. So you enter a system, that machine is idle, you look for another machine, you find an idle machine and you go there, and then the distributed scheduler has bought you something. Okay? If you join a system and there is nowhere and no need to move anywhere, no need for distributed scheduling. If you join the system and there is nowhere to move, so every machine is idle, again there is no benefit. The only benefit comes if you join the system and you end up at a system that is loaded, but there is some other machine that's also idle, so you can actually move there and get some benefit of finishing faster. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, so what that actually shows you is only in the case, in the middle case here, where the system is moderately loaded, will this scenario actually be true. Okay? The lightly loaded world, there's no need to do anything. The heavily loaded world, there is nothing you can do. Okay? Only when it is moderately loaded, the system as a whole, there are some machines that seem to be lightly loaded and others are more heavily loaded. That's why it's, the load on a whole is sort of, the average load is somewhere in the middle, maybe 50% utilized or 40% utilized. In that scenario, you get some benefit of distributed scheduling. Then you may, by bad luck, enter a system which seems to be more heavily loaded than others, and you actually get a benefit of rejoining or being moved to a lightly loaded system. Okay? And so that this probability here gets sort of peaks somewhere in the middle. And so this curve as a whole really is showing you where do you get the benefit of doing distributed scheduling. And the answer is only when the system is moderately loaded. In the two extremes, there is not much benefit. Okay? Whatever I said there is actually explained in text here. There's high utilization, little benefit. Low utilization, rarely a job waiting, so no need to move. So it's only potentially useful when the system is moderately loaded. So this is something to keep in mind. Yeah, so you won't actually get a lot of benefit because there are overheads in taking a job and moving it to another machine. Not as simple as just taking a job task and moving it to another core on that machine. You have to copy data, you have to do a lot of extra work. So you have to ask when is this going to be actually beneficial before you put in the effort. So yes.
I'm just curious, what do the different curves correspond to?
Different curves here were actually corresponding to how jobs arrive into the system and things like that. Arrival rates. So I didn't actually go into the details of how they were derived. But that was not really something we should worry about here.
Right.
There's not just.
But it seems that one of the curves has a larger range where it's like the dispute is coming.
Yes. So it also depends on how jobs arrive into the system, the rate and the length of the job. All of those matter, which I ignored completely. But you can study this from a queuing theoretic perspective and get all these curves. Okay, so the thing to keep in mind is distributed scheduler does have utility, but its utility is somewhat limited to when the system is moderately loaded as a whole. So in the two other extremes, you can either there's nothing to do or you cannot do much. Okay, so that's where it's somewhat limited. Okay, now, having understood that, let's actually go and look at a little more details of how you go about designing these distributed schedules. Okay, so there are many policies. This was an area that was very active in the 90s. So this was an area of research that was very active in the 90s. Many systems were developed. We used to look at some of those systems today. Some of those ideas are now present in some distributed schedulers that we'll also look at in this part of case studies. We will not today, but next time. But to understand what these are doing, we need to understand what are we trying to achieve from our distributed scheduler. What do we want to optimize in your system? Because the first question we want to see is when should you invoke this distributed scheduler? When does it make sense? So you can say you have to have some measure of load, both on your system as well as on other system, that is going to let you decide whether to move a job and where to move it. Okay, so you can use different matrix for that. It could be the queue length, it could be the CPU utilization, any number of matrices. Okay. We will see many different policies. We will see static policies where the decisions are hardwired into the system on what to do, yeah, as far as distributed scheduling is concerned. We will see dynamic policies where the decision is based on actually querying the load on the system and deciding based on the load responses from various system what to do. We see adaptive policies where the policy itself changes based on the load. What your scheduling algorithm does is itself changing. That in one regime we use one algorithm, in another regime we use another algorithm. So we'll have, those are referred as adaptive policies. We'll look at examples of all of these. Okay? Policies here can be preemptive or non-preemptive. An important distinction. Okay, let me pause there and explain that. But first, I presume people know what preemptive and non-preemptive means. Yes? No? So you probably know what it means in the uniprocessor world. Preemption essentially means if the kernel is allowed to eject you from the CPU, preempt you from the CPU, that's called preemptive. Non-preemptive means once you get to run on the CPU, even the kernel cannot eject you from the CPU. You get to run until completion or you block. Okay? What does this mean in the distributed scheduling world? It's not the same thing. We're using the same term, but it is slightly different. Preemptive distributed scheduling essentially means after a process has started executing, okay, you still can move it to another machine. Yeah, that means that you are actually taking a process that's currently executing and moving that process. Non-preemptive scheduler essentially means you can only do, once a process starts executing, you cannot move it to another machine. It has to run. The only time you can move it is after you submit a command. Before the command turns into a process, can you ship that command to some other machine and start executing it? Is that clear? So preemptive essentially means even after the job has started executing, you are allowed to preempt, meaning pause that execution of the job and move it somewhere else. Okay? In this case, you have to actually take that process and move it. You can't restart it. Okay? Non-preemptive means you are not allowed to do that. The scheduler cannot move a task after it has begun executing. So where to execute that task, that decision has to be made before the task begins executing. Once you have submitted the request, that is the time you decide. Does it run on machine I or machine J? Okay, once it starts executing, it becomes a process, then you cannot move it. Okay? As you can imagine, non-preemptive distributed schedulers are easier to implement. So they just require you to take the request that has come in and begin executing it on some machine, and that's the only point in time where you have to decide where to run it. Okay? Preemptive schedulers are more flexible. So if the load on the machine changes after the job has begun executing, you can still move it somewhere else. Okay? But they're also more complicated because you are actually moving a process. This involves something called process migration. So you take a process that's actually running process, move that entire process somewhere else and it continues to run exactly where it left off. Much harder to implement. You probably haven't seen anything like that in the typical operating system world, but these techniques exist. We'll look at it. Okay. So one is easier, the other one is more flexible, but more complex. So that's how our design decision we'll look at again in more detail. You can also have centralized versus decentralized policies. In a centralized policy, there's a coordinator for all of these n machines. Coordinator decides which task runs on which machine. Coordinator keeps track of the load on all the machines. It checks the load, decides what happens next. It's centralized. In a decentralized world, each machine makes its own decisions. There's no central coordinator. So you have to implement distributed scheduling, but each machine is just going to do its own thing. Saying, should I run this job here? Should I send it somewhere else? You make local decisions. Yeah. Look at both of those. There are issues of stability If you look at it, when you send a job to another machine, you better make sure that that machine doesn't get overloaded. Okay? These kinds of problems can occur because you may have one machine in the system that's idle. Okay? You will see policies where the machine goes and announces, I'm idle, send me jobs. Okay? 10 other machines dump jobs on that one machine. That machine now becomes more overloaded than everyone. If you don't have policies that deal with this, you will have instabilities. Where machine becomes idle, lots of jobs arrive, machine becomes overloaded, it tries to send that job somewhere else, and this jobs keeps hopping from one machine to another. And your system becomes unstable because you're not making progress, you're simply wasting all your cycles sending jobs from one machine to another. You're doing wasted work. So you don't want to avoid those scenarios. You don't have techniques that are going to give you stable behavior, not have oscillations or things like that. So here are some components. So when we look at, I'll present 3 or 4 different policies. We look at them from the following perspective. We decompose that policy into 4 parts. First one we'll call the transfer policy. Okay? When to transfer a process? When is the distributed scheduler invoked at all? Okay, when does it decide it's time for me to shift some tasks to another machine? Okay, that's called the transfer policy. The other one is called selection policies. So once I've chosen a task to send somewhere else, how do I decide which machine to send it to? Okay. The first one is when to transfer, this one is which process, sorry. The selection policy is not where to send it, but which process to send. Okay. The location policy is where to send it. Okay. So you have to make this decision. When should I invoke distributed scheduling? Which process or processes should I offload from this machine? Which other machine should I send it to? Okay. And last but not least, what information do I need to keep about the system in order to make all of these decisions? So they need to know loads on other machines, and they need to know their own load, and to figure all that out. So what do I need to track as far as the system as a whole is concerned? Okay. 4 components. I haven't described any policy yet. I'm just talking about 4 decisions we have to make in order to implement any policy, whatever that is. Okay? Any questions on this before I start talking about the policy? Yes.
The previous page you said there was a load imbalance and all that, and stability instability system. Is that true only for the centralized case or for the distributed case we are talking about?
The question is, I talked about load instabilities and so on, and whether that can occur only in the centralized case or in the distributed case. It is more likely to occur in the distributed case if you are not careful, for sure, because each machine is making local decisions without necessarily coordinating with other machines. So we may independently all make the same decision, which may end up to being a bad global decision, even though locally it seems like the right thing to do. The centralized case, if you have a global view of the system, it is possible to avoid such mistakes. That doesn't mean that there is no centralized policy which won't introduce instability. But because you are actually doing all of the decision making at one place, you know what is happening in the system as a whole, so there are less chances you may make similar mistakes. And that's the rule of thumb, not a guarantee that one technique can always avoid instability and the other cannot. Any other questions? Okay. So let's start with the first and the very simplest policy. It's called the sender initiated policy. As the name suggests, okay, the sending machine is responsible for doing all the distributed scheduling. Sending machine is a machine that decides it has some tasks or that it wants to send to some other machine. So that's called sender initiated. A transfer policy, when to invoke scheduling. Very simple threshold base. So you can say, I wait until the utilization in the system exceeds the threshold, 70%. If it goes above 70%, I'm going to try to actively offload some tasks to other machine. Or I just look at the number of tasks in my run queue that you have shown here. Just say how many tasks are in my queue. If there are more than 10 tasks, I decide I'm going to send some of these tasks somewhere else. A very simple threshold-based policy on when to invoke it, when to start distributed scaling. Selection policy. So you can have any number of selection policy, but here we are assuming a non-preemptive world. Non-preemptive world basically says I can only take newly arrived tasks which are not yet begun executing and send them somewhere else. I'm not actually taking an executing process and moving. So that involves process migration, more complicated. Simplest thing I can do is when user types a command, I just decide, should that command execute here or should I take that command and send it somewhere else and execute it? So I don't have to deal with command has begun executing, now it's a process, I now ship that process. That's much harder than taking that command and shipping it somewhere else and executing it. They're only newly arrived processes. Location policy, which says where should I send it. Okay, so the machine is loaded, I have a newly arrived process, I have to pick where to send it. Okay, so now that depends on how you decide which machine to pick. You can pick a machine at random. Yeah, I toss a coin. Okay? And the machine that basically is chosen randomly based on this coin. Okay, and I just ship it. Another one is that I actually poll the machine. I send request saying, tell me your load. And the machines respond, I can pick the least loaded. I can poll sequentially or I can poll in parallel. I can just start machine 1 telling me your load. If your load is below some threshold, I say, okay, your likelihood is on that. So I just keep polling until I find a least loaded machine that's polling in sequence, or I can just broadcast a request to all the machines, all of them respond, and then basically I pick the one that happens to be the least. Okay. So these are scenarios where instability is connected. If multiple senders are hunting for machines to send jobs to, and they broadcast and then one machine sends a very low load information, suddenly it may see that a large number of jobs start arriving. That's how you have to deal with it. So this by itself is not going to deal with any instability. So you see that if you simply implement this as is, you might have problems. So you have to be a little more careful. Yeah. How can you be more careful? You can basically, rather than choosing the least loaded, you can pick the top K least loaded and randomly pick from them. Okay, that way, if even the top K may be the same across all the senders, each sender might pick a different machine. So you can do some simple things like that to avoid instability. There are many other techniques that just work. Okay, that's sender initiative. Any questions on this? Okay, so next policy is receiver initiative. Okay, you should be able to now design this yourself. Now that I told you how there are 4 decisions to be made. The sender initiated the machine that was loaded, made all the decisions, saying, I decide when to invoke this policy, I go hunting for a machine, I send the job in. The receiver initiative is exactly the opposite. If you are lightly loaded, you want to go hunt for jobs to take on. You are the receiver of the job, so you go looking for work. You are the machine, go looking for work. Okay, so you can ask the same kind of question. First of all, you are going to basically trigger this only when your load drops below a threshold. So if you are less than 10% utilized, you declare yourself the receiver and go ask for more work. So if the departing process caused the load to fall below a threshold, you have to go and become a receiver and you go find it. Yes, selection policy, what kinds of jobs are you willing to accept? Again, you can say, I only want newly arrived jobs. You say, if any machine has a newly arrived job, you need to take it. Or if your machine support process migration, which we haven't yet seen how to do it. If you support process migration, then you are willing to accept partially executed jobs, which means there are already processes. I'll ask the machine to transfer that process, not just the request. Can execute. So either of those two would work. Even in the sender initiated, you could have one process migration. Okay. Location policy, again, same kinds of techniques work. Okay, you can basically go poll machines, say tell me your load, pick the most heavily loaded machine and say I am going to relieve some load from your queue and then send me a job. Okay. You can poll in sequence, you can poll in parallel, same kind of techniques work. So exactly the same kinds of ideas. You just go looking for work, you look for more heavily loaded machines and ask them to send you somewhere. Any questions on this? So we'll do one more policy and then we are going to stop today. This one is called symmetric policy. The symmetric policy basically says that both sender initiated and receiver initiated techniques coexist in this system. Okay? Depending on your load, you may be a sender actively actively trying to offload jobs, or you may be a receiver hunting for jobs. So you do both. Some machines are looking for work, others are waiting to send, trying to send work, and there are some machines that are neither. Okay, so here, as this figure shows, you have two thresholds, a low threshold and a high threshold. Any machine whose load goes above the high threshold becomes a sender. Any machine whose load goes below a low threshold becomes a receiver. Machines in the middle are doing neither. They're neither trying to send jobs nor looking to receive jobs. So they are just happily executing whatever they have. They're not trying to do anything. So those are the okay machines. So those we will look. Okay, so you are the sender or you are the receiver. So again, the same kind of techniques are going to apply here. If you are the sender, if your load falls below, rises below a threshold, high threshold, you become a sender. You implement whatever we said in the sender initiated policy. You go poll, first to pick some task which you want to offload. Then you go poll machines, find a machine that is lightly loaded and try to send it along. Okay? And vice versa. If your load falls below a threshold, you become a receiver. You go start polling machines, you basically ask for work and you receive work. So the both of these will work. So the reason it's good to have both is when you have very large systems. Let's say you have 10,000 nodes in the system. Okay? If you have both senders and receivers actively trying to do something, the chances that you will basically accomplish your task faster goes up. Otherwise, a sender may have to poll up to 10,000 machines before it knows what to do. Yeah, and the same thing for the receiver. So the matchmaking can actually become really faster if you have both machines actively trying to send jobs and machines actively trying to receive jobs. Okay. So we will stop here. We ran out of time for the rest. There are some case studies of real systems that we will look at next time that implement these policies. I mean, I've just described things in a very abstract, very simplistic manner. We'll see what real systems are actually done. There are 4 systems we'll look at, and then we'll move on to the next topic. Okay, so let's stop here today.